Alex Krainer, um, and we were back. Thank you very much, Alex, for joining me. I'm Michael Rabowski. I'm your host. We're going to discuss a lot happening before we get into all the global issues. The top story right now is the story with, as I see it, and you may agree, Slovakia and the Ukrainians blocking the energy flow to Central Europe. We see tension between Bratislava and Budapest brewing with regards to Kiev. So if we could start off, my question to you is, Alex, what do you see happening with Ukraine and NATO and its members? Will there be friction between Brussels and the member nation states like Hungary and Slovakia with regards to their dissenting position towards Kiev? How do you see it?
I think there's been a great deal of tension between the EU, Brussels, and Hungary and Poland and some other states, some other countries for a long time over various different reasons. I think that Ukraine is merely one of the biggest and most recent issues, and other issues have to do with migration, with net zero policies. There were issues with COVID, pandemic, and so on. European Union is an undemocratic bureaucracy imposed on other countries. And I think that it's not long for this world. I think that it doesn't have a future. I think that NATO doesn't have a future either. And I think that there's a good chance that it'll be the beginning of the end, this Ukrainian situation now. So, from Ukrainian side, we're looking at also an illegitimate government because Volodymyr Zelensky should have ran elections before December last year. His mandate has expired. He's an illegitimate president, so he's merely a stand-in, who is there because I suppose the Western powers accept him as such, and so they keep sending him money. Regardless of all that, Zelensky is losing on the battlefield. So the country is falling apart. The economy has imploded. And I guess in his desperation to save himself, not only as a president of Ukraine, but even his life in the physical sense, he's thrashing around. And one of the things he has done is he has cut off the gas supplies to Slovakia, to Hungary, to a lesser extent, places like Austria. But I think that he has done so with the blessing of NATO and the European Union, because this is a way to hurt Slovakia and Hungary, who have been less than enthusiastic about supporting Ukraine, who have been among the foremost unbelievers in the project Ukraine. And, hurting them in this way could destabilize the governments. And then maybe, the Western Empire could get a regime change there and get a new government that would be maybe more suitable to their agenda. We'll see how that ends. We have now major efforts underway to bring about color revolution in Slovakia, to do away with Robert Fico and bring his opposition to power. But Robert Fico is being very vocal about it. They understand the playbook. They understand what's coming against them. And I think that he has prepared to defend Slovakia, its constitutional order against the regime change in this sense. I think that Viktor Orban is a bit ahead of him in this respect, because I think about 2 or 3 years ago, Viktor Orban had a major purge of the Hungarian army, of the military, and he removed, I think, about 140 military generals who were, let's say, most closely associated with NATO, with the Western powers. And I'm pretty sure that they are communicating together and that they're helping one another. So in the same way that the Western powers haven't been able so far to regime change Georgia for the same reasons, they might not necessarily be able to regime change Slovakia and Hungary. And in that case, I think that there's a good chance that Hungary simply leaves the EU, which would be the beginning of the end of European Union, for sure. So I think that, this whole misadventure in Ukraine could be, in the end, fatal both for the European Union and for NATO.
Thank you. Let's continue our focus on Europe before we go global, if I may say. You mentioned regime change. We're seeing attempts to perhaps suppress the vote in Romania with Georgescu. We've seen Vucic now, if I may use the word, deposed by huge, massive opposition on the domestic front. Do you see the hand of Brussels in these operations? Is the West trying to destabilize the Balkans as well?
I have no doubt that that's the case. So whether it's Brussels, whether it's NATO, whether it's MI6, whether it's the CIA, I don't know how the plumbing is laid out exactly. I don't know, but it usually goes via CIA, MI6, and then it goes to the non-governmental organization in these countries like Serbia, Slovakia, Georgia, and so forth. But I think that all these regimes have wisened up a little bit to all this. We've already had in Serbia this whole we had an organization called Otpor, which was instrumental to taking down Slobodan Milosevic 20 some years ago. And I think that the authorities there they know everything about these organizations. Belgrade is in fact one of the headquarters of these regime change operations. So, an immune system will be built and existing that will push back against any such attempts. The Balkans are, one of the designated crisis flashpoints, which the Western Empire will activate if they can and if they must. As with every other crisis flashpoint, the strategy has been pretty much articulated in various writings by Halford Mackinder about a century ago, where the British Empire, the leading ideologues and stakeholders of the British Empire understood that they had a vulnerability as a maritime empire, and they came to believe that a land-based empire could emerge on the continent on the Eurasian continent, and that such an empire could gain strength to become not only a rival, but it could actually eclipse and displace the British Empire. And so they studied very hard geography and history, and they determined that this the ideal geographic position for such an empire to emerge in was the so-called pivot area. Halford Mackinder first formulated this in a paper he published in, I think, 1905. It was titled The Geographical Pivot of History. And so the fear was that there are such vast amounts of natural resources and population available there that it could give it could spawn an economic world completely independent of British control, of the control of the British Empire, and that it would become capable of gaining such strength that it would overpower the British Empire, and not only on land but also in maritime traffic, because all these resources would allow this empire to build much bigger navies than were possible for the maritime empire. And so they saw this as a long-term threat to the British Empire, to their hold on the world. And so Halford Mackinder himself proposed a strategy about how to make sure that this doesn't happen. And basically, the idea was that they would surround this pivot area, and they already understood that the most likely power to emerge in this, pivot area would be Russia. And particularly about the same time when Halford Mackinder wrote his thesis, was when the Russians introduced the Trans-Siberian Railway, and the British understood that this Trans-Siberian Railway would be exactly the element that could galvanize this economic development and rise of the whole pivot to political, economic, and military strength. And so the idea was to surround it by these crisis flashpoints. And at that time, Mackinder was talking about France, Italy, Egypt, India, and Korea. But over the last 100 years, things have changed, so they also, now they have these crisis flashpoints practically lined up from the Baltics down to the Eastern Mediterranean, and then all the way across the southern range of Eurasian continent to Koreas. And they took care to leave a divided Korea, north and south, so they could trigger wars there. Then they divided India into India and Pakistan, and then to the eastern side, India and Bangladesh. And so practically the whole continent is one big arc of crisis, or this flashpoint that they can trigger and use to destabilize not only Russia, but also China or Iran or any other, let's say, regional power that could jeopardize their hegemony in the region. A regional power who could say no to the empire, who could say, no, we're not going to do it the way you want. We're going to do it the way we decide. And so Balkans are one of those flashpoints, and Balkans were in fact used to trigger the war of the First World War. It started there in rising tensions between Serbia and Austria-Hungary, and the Austrian Empire. And then, the British secret diplomacy and their intelligence services made sure that there was no diplomatic solution to that conflict. We're talking about the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. And so it just went from bad to worse until the march to war became irreversible. And this could happen today. I think this is the reason why the United States carved away Kosovo from Serbia and put the biggest military base in Kosovo, in that part of Europe. And today it pretty much serves as a as an incubator of jihadi terrorists that are then sent to Syria or to wherever they are needed. And of course, they can be used to destabilize Serbia, to force Serbia to intervene in Kosovo, and then to try to orchestrate some kind of a big war by, allied powers against Serbia, because, we have to defend the rules-based international order. But on the positive side, I think that this whole great game is getting away from them. I think that in so many nations, the leadership has learned the playbook, and they're no longer falling for provocations as easily. They're no longer, reacting in a knee-jerk fashion. And we saw that with with Syria and with Israel Israel's assault on Gaza. It was from the very get-go, the intent was to orchestrate a wider regional war in the Middle East. But neither Hezbollah in Lebanon nor Iran nor any of the other powers took the bait. So the wider regional war hasn't happened yet. It's not to say that it might not happen, but with these things, timing is also of the essence. So it didn't work. Their gambit in Ukraine
Precisely.
Yeah, their gambit in Ukraine.
I know the Middle East is, yeah. I just the Middle East is something I would like to touch on, Alex Krainer. And you gave us a historical perspective, mentioning the father of geopolitics, Sir Halford Mackinder. We need to have that as a guidepost for what's happening today, absolutely. And I'm so pleased that you give us this perspective, historically speaking. If I may ask, do we see a World War III scenario happening, in the sense that the West, with its hegemony in a downward spiral, do we see Russia, China, maybe an axis forming in North Korea, Iran, in order to coalescing together to possibly face the West in a global military confrontation? Can we envisage something like that? In particular, with Trump coming to power, will the United States avoid a potential global third world war, or are we destined to head for another world war, in your view, Alex Krainer?
There's definitely a coalescing of powers who wish to resist the diktat of the empire, and that's, of course, as you mentioned, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. I hesitate a little bit, but it seems to me that Turkey is gravitating in that direction as well. So is Azerbaijan. I think all of these powers understand that making nice with the empire is merely, winning the privilege of being the last one to be sacrificed. So there's no making a deal with the empire that the empire is going to honor. They're going to turn around and strike against you at the first convenience, whenever it suits them. So that's now fairly well understood. Whether we are inevitably sliding into World War III, I think is, depending on how you define World War III, because in some ways you could also say that we are already in it. And it's not the question of whether we're going to go into World War III. It doesn't correspond with the images we got used to from Hollywood films of a clash of great armies on battlefronts. That happened in Ukraine, but the Western Empire today, I think, is far too weak to even attempt to confront Russia, or Russia united with Iran and China and possibly some other powers. What they do instead is they try to co-opt, cultivate and finance and direct terrorist organizations, separatist movements in different countries. And they also work through non-government organizations to try to orchestrate color revolutions and regime changes. This is, I think, these are the only tools that are available to the West against such powers as Russia, Iran, China, Turkey, Azerbaijan. Well, they've done it in Pakistan and Bangladesh. They've been successful there, but they've been successful only in, scoring the regime change, not necessarily getting the new regimes to be unquestionably obedient to the empire. That's still a struggle for them. This is all falling apart on them. And then, the Chinese and the Russians, they are, they're building up these multipolar integrations, which include the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is now developing also military means of resistance and defense of their, sovereignty and of their approach to governance of society. And they have specifically, they published policy papers about this, in which they have specifically set out that their target are terrorist organizations, separatist movements, and the NGO, the NGO archipelago, the open societies, national endowments for democracies, the USAID of this world. So they're studying their enemies. They're learning ways and means of confronting them, of weakening them, of disabling them. And we see that in some places they're successful. One of them is Georgia. Now, Georgia, it looks like they resisted the onslaught of the Western regime change operators by themselves, but I expect that they had some help. And then we also saw attempted regime changes in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, in Tajikistan, and in Turkey over the last few years, and all of those failed. So, it's getting harder and harder for the Western Empire to achieve its own goals. And, when it comes to the Middle East, let's not forget that those 7 countries that were supposed to be regime changed in 5 years. When was that? That was 2003, 2004, I think, when Wesley Clark said that. Well, it's been 20 years, not 5 years. And we see that, their brilliant victory in Syria last month, in December 2024, is now turning into a nightmare. And I think that this was exactly the intended effect to, rather than confronting them there and weaken their own defenses, the regional powers there, i.e., Iran and Russia, led the Western Empire into a quagmire, into a trap. And now we see that, just today or yesterday, Tulsi Gabbard gave a statement about Erdogan, how he is not a friend of the United States, how he's an Islamist dictator, and this and that. So it indicates that there are very significant problems in those relations, because Turkey is an ally of the United States. They're both members of NATO. Turkey is by far the strongest and largest military in NATO. So for Tulsi Gabbard to be lambasting Erdogan publicly on television in the United States is a pretty it's an indicator of very, very significant problems on those relations. And then, let's not forget that the United States is also allied with the Kurds, who are, on the other hand, completely on hostile terms with the Turks. So they've really, really let themselves into a big mess, and they've drawn Israel into a big mess, which, by the way, Israel is also one of the specifically designated beachheads, which serve the purpose of destabilizing the region, which has done its job for the last 70 or so years. But I think it's also coming to an end.
If I may say, as a proxy of the West, Israel is doing the bidding. If as I see it, I don't since the Cold War of the Western powers, in stirring up trouble, if I may say. But if we can spotlight like to the Middle East, as since Syria is, I'm sure, on the minds of many people, and Turkey, do we see Syria as going the route of Afghanistan or a civil war like in Ukraine? Uh, I know this is a bundle of questions, Alex Krainer, but it's related to Trump's 2.0. Will the United States become more interventionist or disengaged from the Middle East and from Europe? But let's just focus on Syria. What do you see the scenario for Syria? A failed state? Do you see Turkey intervening and as an expansionist power, reasserting its sphere of influence? Can we foresee maybe a clash between Israel and Turkey? And what might the great powers, China, Russia, the United States, be doing to either destabilize or maybe stabilize Syria, in your view, Alex Krainer?
My guess would be that we might see the region pacified by dividing spheres of influence between the two major regional powers there, which are Iran and Turkey. So I know that the Turks have certain ambitions to recreate some semblance of an Ottoman Empire and to be a big regional power. And they do have claims on parts of Syria. And how that's going to go, I don't know, but I think it's quite possible that they will get that. Whether Syria will exist and in what form in the future, I'm not sure, but it might. There's Iran to the east, and there's Lebanon to the west. Lebanon is increasingly dominated by Hezbollah politically and militarily, and Hezbollah is allied with Iran, and so that creates a Shia crescent there in the Middle East, which might in fact come to dominate Syria, and maybe then Syria is going to become a region of some kind of a I wouldn't say caliphate because it has now a very negative connotation, but some kind of a new version of a Persian Empire. So you might end up having a Persian Empire bordering with the Ottoman Empire once more. I think that's entirely reasonable, and maybe it's a better way to pacify the region, to have peace, because what we've had now for the past 200 years has been an insecurity architecture, which was deliberately built up by the British Empire and overtaken again by the American Empire, as is. The Americans only took over from the Brits and continued the same type of policies. It could not. I can't imagine that would be worse. So there's going to be screaming and gnashing of teeth in the West because we've become so attached to this post-war world order, which brought us peace and prosperity. But that's not really true. It brought peace and prosperity to the what they call the golden billion in the West, but it didn't bring peace and prosperity to most of the rest of the world. So maybe this will be a better solution, and I think that what's going on in Syria is now part of the demolition of the old system so that the new system could be erected. And part of that might be the end of Israel. And Israel has now upgraded Turkey as their number one enemy in the region. They've overtaken Iran. And at the same time, there are many, many people in Turkey who want to see the end of Israel as well. So a confrontation between Israel and Turkey is hard to imagine because Israel is a nuclear power. But in one way or another, Israel is going to find itself under increasing pressure. It's surrounded by hostile powers. Its economy is suffering. Its society is beginning to resemble a failed state. Certain essential social services are no longer functioning in Israel. Many Israeli Jews are thinking, okay, this is not working out. I'm running back.
We lost you, unfortunately. Let's see if we can reconnect. Oh, we got you back. All right. No, we just had a quick we had a technical glitch. When you mentioned Israel and the Exodus, suddenly the karma got activated. You see, when topics come up, you never know what can happen. And just sticking with Syria, and as Alex Krainer is pointing out, this is a crucial period for Israel, crucial period for Turkey, and all the powers that have influence in that region, and specifically in Syria. If we may just shift back to Europe and the other conflict zone, Ukraine and Trump, do we see a similar scenario in Ukraine like in Syria? In other words, the great powers clashing or coming to an agreement, and I personally see partition of Ukraine. But I'm just as some people call me, the Joe Sixpack in the room. Do you see a partition or a possible division of spheres of influence in Ukraine? In other words, Poland has, I think, some designs over Western Ukraine. Hungary has its Transcarpathian history and links to that part of the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. And now that the Russians are practically at the Dnieper and have control practically of 40 or 50% of the territory. Whoops, I think we lost Alex again. We'll see if we can get him back. There you go. Sorry about that. There you go. Alex, do you foresee a partitioning of Ukraine similar to the scenario you painted with Syria? Can you hear me? No? Oops.
Okay.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. I apologize. I'm okay. I can hear you now.
Okay. Perfect. So did you hear my question? Sorry. Do you foresee a partitioning of Ukraine similar to the situation you painted, the scenario in Syria?
I believe that's entirely possible, although it's not clear what happens with Western Ukraine, and it's not clear how far. Do you hear me?
Yeah, you're coming across loud and clear.
It's not clear what the Russian demands are going to be after the war, because I think it's very likely that the Russians are going to ask for in one way or another, they're going to assert their control over all of the west coast. Sorry, all of the west coast of the Black Sea. So they're going to take over Odessa. Maybe not militarily, but administratively, I'm certain that they will, and that means that they will completely leave the Western Ukraine landlocked. Now, the opinions out of Russia and out of Belarus are that there is no way that they will allow Poland to claim any part of Western Ukraine, or at least they will make it very difficult for them. I think that much will change as we have, you know, political changes in Europe, i.e., you know, we'll see what happens with the elections in Romania. We'll see what happens with the elections in Germany, which are scheduled now for you know, in about 3 weeks' time. I think that ultimately, in the fullness of time of history, we will probably, you know, Germany through history in tumultuous time has tended to side with Russia. In the end, it's tended to gravitate towards Russia. And I think that's a logical outcome this time around as well, because Germany is actually surrounded by powers which are nominally allies, but in reality, they're not allies. Poland is more on hostile terms with Germany than on friendly terms. The same is true for the same is true about France. And then, you know, to the north, they have Scandinavian countries, which also are not exactly friendly with Germany.
But pardon for this interjection, but they have this strange arrangement, Weimar, this trilateral cooperation between Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw. Do you see that as a kabuki theater? Because, as you say, there is hostility amongst the three. Why do you see why do they pretend to be sort of allies and working as a three amigos when, as you say, there is this you know, underlying friction between the three, especially towards Germany?
I think it's the vestige of the, you know, post-World War order, which has, you know, carved out Europe into two opposing blocks. And so to the west, you had Italy, France, Germany as the main central powers who were allies, but their alliance was solidified by opposition to, you know, the Soviet bloc, to the communist bloc, and it took some work to make that happen. You know, they had to eliminate communists in Greece, in Italy. They, you know, the CIA and MI6 worked together to make sure that both Greece and Italy gravitated to the West, and that took some dirty deeds, including cultivating terrorist organizations that were very active through the 60s and 70s and into the 1980s. You know, there was a famous Operation Gladio, which was supposedly left-wing extremist organizations that were wreaking terrorism in the west of Europe, but in fact it was all later found in court proceedings in Italy that it was all coordinated by NATO. And so now that this opposition is dissipating, because I think it will dissipate, I think that we are increasingly starting to understand that Russia is not our enemy, that we don't have to close ranks to confront Russia. Then I think some of those centuries-old rivalries will become more actual again. And I think that what you suggested could conceivably be the future of Europe, where you will have Germany that's going to dominate once more the Central Europe. Russia and Belarus will, you know, dominate the heartland, as Mackinder put it, and the countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, all the way down to Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, they might end up forming what the Western think tanks defined as the intermarium, from the Baltic Sea down to the Mediterranean, some kind of a loose political economic association, which might actually form a sort of a buffer between, let's say, the West and the East. But the question is, Western thinkers conceive this as the intermarium to be a Western controlled entity or association, but it might end up being a more sovereign entity, or even more on friendly terms with the Eastern powers, with Russia and China, because let's not forget, part of all this is also economic development. And I think there's far more potential for that by joining up with the BRICS, with the Belt and Road Initiative. I think there's far more security by becoming a member of this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and becoming active with the International North-South Corridor that goes from the Indian Ocean through Gulf, the Persian Gulf, all the way up to the Baltic coast, which will be a better trade route than going through Suez and around the Mediterranean. And then also that comes out to the new Arctic route, which is being developed now. The Russians and the Chinese are actively developing this, and they're working on keeping it open year-round. And this is why Russia is developing their fleet of icebreakers. They will be building icebreaker container ships and bulk carriers. And I think that by now Russia has about 70 icebreakers, of which I think about a dozen are nuclear. And just for contrasts, the United States only has 2 icebreakers of any description. So they're far, far ahead of that. It's a new world that is emerging, and it's really, really getting away from the Western Empire. In fact, the more you analyze these developments, the more you see that Mackinder was actually very correct. But in a way, their attempts at preventing this land empire from emerging, and one of the key parts of that was that there was meant to be, they had to prevent the collusion of regional powers on the Eurasian continent from coming together, especially China and Russia. But now you have China, Russia, and Iran. So everything that they tried to prevent from happening is actually happening now. But we're not yet to the point of what Mackinder was afraid of, that there would be such powerful economic development on the Eurasian continent that they would be able to build fleets much larger and much stronger than what was possible for the maritime empire. But we're moving in that direction, and I think that it's an irreversible change, and there's next to nothing that the United States today's reincarnation of the British Empire can do to prevent that from happening. Short of a nuclear Armageddon, of course.
Absolutely, that's one scenario we certainly don't want to contemplate. Alex Krainer, as we move to the final segment, and we could perhaps shift to the Western Hemisphere, we've heard President Trump in his 2.0 administration make, I don't know how you would characterize it, some would say outlandish, perhaps far-fetched statements of Canada becoming the 51st state and annexing Greenland, of course, which is both are tremendously rich in resources and could be very important for the United States to reindustrialize or become a great, industrial superpower once again. How seriously do you take these public utterances? Is this a strategy that Trump really is going to implement in his first, let's say, 100 days. That is to expand the United States to form possibly a North American Union with Canada, perhaps get some kind of economic or form of dominance in Greenland in order to exploit or extract its resources. Of course, this is meant to counteract China's, as you mentioned, and Russia's influence in the Arctic. Do you take these statements as being serious? Will he actually implement what he says, or is this just some kind of grandstanding that nobody should be really taking too seriously?
I think that the possibility of Canada becoming absorbed into the United States is entirely realistic. Maybe not all of Canada, but the western part of Canada, Alberta and the west coast of Canada, because that would enable the United States to be connected with Alaska. And this was actually the intent when the Russians sold Alaska to the United States. They expected to have a great ally to the east and a counterweight to the British Empire. And not many people noticed, but one of the people who came to visit Donald Trump before he was even inaugurated, she came to see him at Mar-a-Lago, was Danielle Smith, the premier of Alberta. And so what did they talk about? I don't know. Maybe not about recipes, about cooking. And then Canada is a very strange place in political terms, because it's the only country in the world, I think, where individual provinces can enter into treaties with other foreign countries without actually Ottawa sanctioning it. So there can be a treaty between
Precisely
Alberta and the United States, and Ottawa has no say in that, how that treaty is formulated. So I think that's possible. I think Greenland also could become part of the United States in the future. I don't know if it's realistic that it'll be in the near future or that it'll be in the farther future, but who knows? I think it's necessary to let's see how things play out, because Donald Trump is extremely difficult to read, because he throws a lot of curveballs. And I think that he makes a lot of statements that actually are intended to confound his adversaries, to conceal his real intentions. And so I would like to see what happens when he meets with Vladimir Putin, because I think it's entirely possible that there will be a grand deal where where the United States withdraws from Europe. They withdraw from NATO, they pull all their troops back. And in exchange, they ask for Russian support for the United States to round out their, let's call it, their dominance over their own Western hemisphere, including Canada, including Greenland. And maybe the Russians say, okay, we're fine with that, we don't care. Russians themselves are no longer too terribly attached in the post World War II order. That is to say, they deeply care about the United Nations, about continuing the United Nations, about let's say overhauling it, but keeping it to serve certain functions of maintaining world peace and facilitating global cooperation. But the boundaries, the frontiers between countries, I think it's very possible that we're going to see a wholesale change in that direction, because many of those frontiers were deliberately drawn up to facilitate conflict. but particularly the Middle East, the Sykes-Picot agreements, where they just drew lines arbitrarily to make sure that some some tribe was divided in half, and that they can always use these let's call it independence movement or separatist movements to trigger wars, to trigger crises, to drag regional powers into these quagmires, to weaken them and to reassert their dominance. I think that the Western powers are getting squeezed out of the Eurasian continent increasingly, and I think that it is conceivable that in some kind of a grand deal between Russia, China, and the United States, the Eurasian powers will tell Donald Trump, okay, do your thing in your hemisphere and leave us alone over here. We'll trade, we'll cooperate, we'll be friends, but you can't be here with your troops. You can't be financing terrorists and separatists. You can't be running this archipelago of NGOs to regime change countries to suit yourself. And if you can do that, we can let you have Greenland and Canada, no problem. I think that's possible, but I think we'll have to wait and find out, because it's such a radical departure from the status quo that it's going to be quite a show. I think it'll be difficult for some people to accept. Who knows? There might be regional wars. The British are going to not like it. They're going to try to push back, and they have means, not very powerful means, but fairly destructive means. And so that's who knows? Maybe the French might decide that they want French parts of Canada back, or the Louisiana territory, or.
It's interesting that we're seeing history repeat itself, but on a very kind of a variation on a theme. And you brought up, of course, the overhaul of the United Nations. And in my final question to you, Alex Krainer, since we touched on the BRICS a little bit, and I guess that is an important new world global bloc. How do you see? You mentioned the United States, Russia, China, but isn't the elephant in the room India? How do you see India coming into the picture? I have this, I call it India fetishism, where I would like to see India as a permanent member of the Security Council. Maybe that's far-fetched, but how do you envision India play? What delicate balancing act will it have to perform between East and West, Russia and China, the United States? How do you see it fit into this BRICS arrangement in the coming years, or in the near future? Where does India fit into all of this?
I think that both Russia and China will want to make sure that India stays in their orbit. And I think that the Russians have played a very, very important role to facilitate the end of hostilities between India and China very recently. The West is trying very hard to hold on to their influence in India, because of all the powers in the region, India is the only credible power that they still think they can, pull into their orbit and use them to antagonize China on the one hand, and then, again, the possibility of destabilizing the Middle East and Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iran on the other side. I think, however, that India is also understanding this role, and I think that they're realizing they're not this is not a suitable role for them. This is a very, very dangerous road they're on. India also has a problem with Pakistan on their western border, and India was not very pleased at all I think it was in August, wasn't it, when the West orchestrated a regime change in Bangladesh.
Bangladesh.
Now India has two Pakistans on either side of it. It's sandwiched between two potentially hostile powers. So I think that cultivating relations with India, with China, and with Russia, and becoming an active member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and joining up in the collective security on the Eurasian continent is probably a far better guarantee of India's security than always playing these divide and rule games to suit the Western powers. I remember a few years ago, there was maybe it was 2023, when the Trilateral Commission held their first meeting after the COVID pandemic, and they had it in Tokyo, in Japan, and there were representatives of all the regional powers, Japan and the Philippines and Singapore and South Korea and India and so forth. And I read a little bit the speeches and the papers that came out from that, and they were, the American side of the American representative was Zeke Emanuel, the famous Democratic operative, and they were very excited about India becoming again part of the, coming into the Western orbit as the.
Sorry to interject, Zeke Emanuel. Was he the U.S. ambassador to Japan? Is that correct?
Yes, he was the.
Okay, just wanted to clarify for our viewers. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
And so they were very, very excited that India might become the major rival to China, and that they could use India to, challenge and destabilize and contain China. But in the end, I think that nothing came of it, because the Indians understood that this is only a way to weaken their country, and that all of these roles that the West offers up, we'll give you this favor, but you need to do this for us, in the end up blowing up in their faces. So I think it's generally game over for Western hegemony over Eurasian landmass. I think that we're going to see a completely different future emerge. And I think that the United States might change as well into a completely different country. And instead of being an empire, becoming a regional power that's going to join up with the rest of the world in constructive cooperation and trade.
Alex, and in your sort of concluding insights, let's just sort of end it with Trump's 2.0 administration. Do you think, in a nutshell, if we can put it sort of succinctly, do you think the Trump administration this second time around is going to do a better job or worse job than in the first administration, where we had no real major global conflicts? Do you think he'll be able to destabilize or stabilize the world and prevent new conflicts from brewing and perhaps becoming dangerous wars? Do you think that Trump will perhaps his intentions, however good they may be, will not really materialize in seeing a better world in his second term?
I would expect that Trump 2.0 will be more successful than Trump 1.0. And I would expect that he will be successful at least in part of what he intends. I do believe that he will focus on domestic policies, and that this time around he will be much more effective in, quote unquote, draining the swamp. How effective he will be in terms of foreign policy, I'm not entirely sure, because it seems to me that he's treating foreign policy in a more opportunistic way. He wants to score victories, regardless of whether those victories make sense in the larger scheme of things. But then again, it's very, very difficult to judge Donald Trump precisely because a lot of what he says is, he formulates his statements sometimes to conceal his real intent, sometimes to confound his adversaries, sometimes to gain an advantage in negotiations, to lead other powers to expect something of him, whereas he's ready to give certain concessions. He's ready to be constructive and friendly, but he doesn't want to go there with them expecting that. Kind of like the way he negotiated with North Korea last time around, where he had this very unfriendly exchange with Kim Jong-un, and then he sent his generals to China. He sent them to North Korea. They prepared the terrain. He came for a visit, and they had a very, very cordial visit. And he was the first U.S. president to visit the demarcation zone. And in the aftermath of that, we saw the line of contact between North Korea and South Korea started to become demined, which nobody expected. This was a completely spectacular development. I think ultimately it was frustrated by people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, and it went back to the Cold War mentality. But I think that this time around, Trump is much more decisive, and I do think that he wants to go down with his legacy as a peacemaker, not as a war president. So let's say I'm more optimistic than pessimistic, and I think that at least partially he will be successful. And then depending on what kind of deal he manages to reach with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, I think he might end up being spectacularly successful.
Alex Krainer, on that very positive note that he would go down in history as a peacemaker, peacekeeping, stabilizing president, I want to thank you so much for your international insights and your global overview. Thank you for coming to talk with me on Worldviews, and I look forward to having you back to discuss world events again with your geopolitical perspectives. Thank you so much, Alex Krainer, and perhaps until next time. Au revoir, merci beaucoup. Auf Wiederschauen. Thank you. Adios. Bye-bye.
Michael. Thank you for having me.